This Fleet Equipment Unscripted interview is presented by Hendrickson, a leading manufacturer of heavy-duty suspension systems and components to the global commercial transportation industry. Visit hendrickson-intl.com to learn more.
Hi everyone, I'm Jason Morgan, Content Director for Fleet Equipment, and welcome to Fleet Equipment Unscripted. Today we're talking with Greg Dvorchak, Engineering Supervisor, Application Engineering, Wheel Ends and Brake Systems, Axle Brake and Wheel End Division with Hendrickson. Greg, thanks so much for being on. I think you get the award for the longest title I've ever said, so I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Jason. I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk to you.
So we're going to talk about wheel end issues, right? And this comes up a lot, especially as we look at service issues. It's a critical service issue. So let's just kick us off here, and specifically on the trailer. What are those common trailer wheel end service needs, and how often do you see those PM checks need to happen?
So I guess, firstly, service needs and PMs are, at least in our minds, two very different things. Preventive maintenance is what you do to extend or avoid having to do any of the service work. From our perspective, from our extended service wheel ends, we say that you should do inspections. As far as maintenance or in-service needs, there aren't any really per se. From our perspective, one of those things that we also throw out is there's no such thing as a maintenance-free wheel end. Right. I'd love to think that there was one, but there isn't.
Right.
Now, however, where we usually get stuck is that inspection is maintenance. So if you're doing inspection, even down to the driver doing the pre-trip inspection, right, that's effectively preventive maintenance. Right. From our standpoint, there are things that we ask that you do on a timely basis. Month to month, we ask you to look at the hubcap and make sure it's not cracked or damaged. We like to make sure that there's no leaking coming out from around the hubcap gasket. And then on the other side of the hub, on the wheel seal, we like to look and make sure that there's no lube leaking out of that area as well. And we recommend those once a month.
Okay.
The next thing is looking at the wheel end itself. We suggest lifting the trailer and spinning that wheel. And what you're looking for is quiet and smooth rotation. We suggest doing that every 3 months.
Okay.
Now, again, if something comes up in those inspections that is unexpected, now you're looking at a deeper investigation and possibly leading to servicing.
Right. Okay. Sure.
From
right,
our perspective, if you get to that point, we suggest recommend calling our tech services group first. And the reason is, from our standpoint, if there's something wrong, we want to help guide you through it and make sure you get the right parts and the right procedures to button that system back up appropriately.
Right. Yeah, and that's a good point. That kind of leads me to my next question too. I loved how you outlined how the PM process could potentially lead to a service event. If you're at a service event and it needs attention, and you're disassembling the hubcap and wheel end assemblies. And let's say, and you mentioned it here, you put that back together, you want to make sure you're doing that correctly, but are there any complications or downstream events after doing that you want to look out for if you didn't do it correctly, or any challenges or complications that come from incorrectly disassembling and assembling the hubcap and wheel ends?
There definitely are. From an engineering standpoint, we'd love if you never had to take that hubcap off.
Right.
The minute you do, now you're on to the potential risks or my unofficial things that can go wrong list. From our perspective, there's an inner seal. When you're putting that inner seal back on, you can put that seal in incorrectly and it wouldn't necessarily capture the lube like it's supposed to. The minute you take the hubcap off, you are subject now to introducing contamination to the wheel end. Something as simple as water, or as harsh as any metal rust or anything that can get in there and interfere with the proper operation of the bearings. Setting the wheel end play. That, again, part of our tech service guys, they'll tell you how to set it up appropriately. If you go too far one way or the other, it's too tight or too loose, right, again, you're going to potentially have the bearing life that's not what you expected it to be. The hubcap, you can not tighten the hubcap down, which again could be a source of lube leaking out. The lube itself, All lubes are not compatible with each other. Oil versus grease doesn't work, but grease versus grease, something that is kind of subtle. The chemistry of the grease can be that if you put another grease in, it does not work well. Right. So any of those have the potential to, at best, reduce the life of some of the components. At worst, or not worst, but the next step would be that you get performance that you didn't expect to get. Worst case, you could end up with unsafe operation of the trailer.
Right. And those situations happen, and even as you were describing some of the complications or challenges there, I mean, it really sprung to mind for me that when we talk about service, a lot of the spotlight gets put on advanced technologies, after treatment systems, ADAS, a lot of the technology that's coming into the trucks. But it's important not to overlook or undervalue or not take seriously the technical nature and the importance of getting the wheel end right. It's not just you take it apart and you fix it and you throw the seal in there and you get it back on the road, right? You got to reach out, you got to talk to your service partners and make sure you're going through the proper stages and that your technicians understand how important it is, and not overlook it because they're dealing with this headache over here and this headache over here, and it's just a wheel end. I mean, these are safety critical components that you really want to make sure that you know what you're doing and you're talking to the right people to do that properly.
For sure. Whenever we put the systems together in our plants, we only have a limited number of associates that are trained to do that, right. Because of the risk, but because of the technical nature of what we're doing. So from our standpoint, I completely agree. It's a critical joint and should be put together exactly as recommended.
Right. Well, and there is new technology going in there too. I believe Hendrickson, I mean, you have an outboard mounted rotor that you have available. Can you tell me what that is? What are the benefits? How does that differ from something else I might say?
Sure. Take a step back first. Today's disc brakes that are in the NAFTA marketplace are all, even though they're not called, they're all inboard mounted rotors.
Interesting.
And what that really means is if you look at the flange of the hub that the wheel mounts on, the rotor is mounted towards the center or the inboard side of that flange.
Right.
From that perspective, if you had to do any servicing of that rotor, you're pulling off the hubcap, the bearings, the seals, the hub, the rotor, all off in order to separate that rotor out and be able to work on it. The outboard mounted rotor, again, simplistically, mounts to the outside flange or the side closest to the end of the wheel. And the major benefit to that is if you have to service the rotor comes off by itself. You do not disturb the hubcap, the hub, the bearings, or any of that. So that the primary benefit, we're the engineers, the primary benefit is you maintain the integrity of those bearings in that wheel end.
Right. That makes it.
Benefit.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
No, good. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, that's really interesting because, again, from a technician point of view or service manager point of view, you're identifying I have a brake issue or I have a rotor issue, and I fixed that issue. But if I have a comeback or something happens, it might not come to mind that, oh yeah, I took that whole wheel end apart, I suppose as well, right? There are complications that come from that. Just when you think of it as a brake job, you know what I mean?
You go back to that things that might go wrong list.
Right.
The minute you're taking everything apart, you're back at that square one there.
Right.
And from a practical standpoint, from a technician, if you've had to change rotors on an inboard mounted wheel, I can see those guys clapping for only having to take the rotor itself off when servicing a rotor. Mm-hmm. So there's an added benefit to that, and you're simply removing less parts.
Right.
The time it takes you to do that service is going to be less compared to an inboard mounted rotor. Right. And as always, less service time means less downtime, and everybody is always looking at that.
Right. Well, and going back to it with a unique offering there in the trailer suspension world, right? Again, going back to you should always be contacting your experts, working with your partners, because a tech might assume they might have to take it apart, right? Or they might not know the intricacies of it, and so you want to be able that you're double checking those service requirements and just getting that that validation and that insight from your service partners, because there's a lot going on there, and going back to it, it is safety critical.
For sure. I couldn't agree more.
Greg, I appreciate you taking the time. I learned a lot here. Great insight. I'm sure I'll talk to you again very soon.